Welcome to a new episode of Juan's World. I'm going to continue my series on opposites, and I suspect I'm going to be doing this for some time. I'm going to get into specific opposites now. Remember, if you saw my last video, that I talked about kinds of opposites. There's one that is mathematical or logical, where there is one aspect of something and the opposite aspect, and there is nothing in between, such as odd and even. And then there is the kind where the opposites are at opposite ends of a spectrum or a continuum, and then there are infinite things in between. And then the third kind, which I suspect is the most common kind, that is where there's one thing and its opposite, and then there's just a few things in between, but it's not an infinite continuum. That's undoubtedly what I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to use a number of examples. I've already done male and female, and at some point I may talk about, I don't know, positive and negative, or yes and no, or up and down. Up and down is a very big favorite of mine. But today I'm going to talk about culture and nature. And I'm going to talk about this mostly in the context of an anthropological paradigm called structuralism, and particularly Claude Lévi-Strauss. I've mentioned him before, but I want to talk now specifically about culture versus nature, and I'm going to pick it apart, and actually I'm going to show that we use this in everyday life a lot. For example, when we talk about natural and artificial, that's exactly the same opposition as culture and nature. And I'm going to talk about how natural versus artificial is a false opposite. So let's move into it. Well, this is all rather amusing. I did a little check of my cold open just to make sure that the lighting was okay and the sound was okay, and I noticed I hadn't shaved. So I popped off and had a shave, and so that opposition, shaved and unshaven, is actually a small subsection of cultural and natural. That is, that natural would be unshaven, and cultural would, and shaven would be cultural. Because by those lights, what's natural is what happens to me when I don't use cultural artifacts, like a razor. But let's get into it in more general terms. I think I mentioned in a previous video that something like a honeybee hive or an anthill we consider to be natural, whereas an apartment building would be considered cultural, because ants or honeybees are natural and humans are, in a sense, not natural. That's really the heart of the issue, and I don't think it's a very good one. Although what Lévi-Strauss says is that humans are neurotic about the fact that they are part of nature. that we are animals, mammals, vertebrates, etc. And we don't want to think that we are natural, and so we build a wall around ourselves that is cultural to distinguish ourselves from the natural. Well, there are numerous problems with that, but let me just talk about natural and artificial first. You will see on certain foods or in certain advertisements for foods that all natural ingredients. And there's a very great confusion between natural and healthy. You know, strychnine is natural, cyanide is natural. I don't want a lot of cyanide in my orange juice. Just because the ingredients are natural do not mean that they are good for me. And it doesn't mean that if they are artificial, that they are bad for me. But the distinction is a really interesting distinction. And it points out the nature-culture dichotomy. That is, what artificial means, if you think about the etymology, it's an artifact. That means it's made by humans. I guess we could talk about a chimpanzee artifact, but it means made. I mean, it has art in it, and so that means that it is produced. So artificial means it's an artifact. Well, we can talk about honey as an artifact, and honey is natural. But then when we talk about artificial sweeteners, what we're saying is we made them, and so they're artificial. But if bees make it, then it's natural. Well, that does verify, in a sense, Levi-Strauss's argument that we want to distinguish between things that we make as humans and things that animals or insects or whatever, plants, what they make is natural. I guess I'm okay with that, but where the weakness lies is in arguing that that distinction is universal. That's the point that Levi-Strauss wants to make. That it's not just Westerners or, in his case, the French or the English or Americans who make this distinction. He's saying that everybody worldwide makes this distinction. And of course, that's one of the big issues in anthropology is what makes us human. And we need to find human universals, and they're really hard to find in specific. I mean, all humans speak language. Okay, that's one that's very clear. Do all humans practice in their cultures, not every individual, but does every culture have marriage? There we get into a little bit of difficulty because we think they do, but all the cultures in the world have different ideas about what marriage is. What about incest? Well, that does seem to be universal. In fact, incest between mother and son seems to be a universal prohibition. But incest between cousins, for example, that's variable. And you might want to check, and you'll find that in the United Kingdom, sexual relations between cousins is not prohibited, and in most states in the United States it's not prohibited. It is prohibited in some. It used to be about 13. I don't know what the exact number is now. So one question that anthropologists are always raising is, what are the universals? And of course I've been saying that opposites in general are universal, and that's partly because negation is universal. We all have a way of saying not, or this is something and this is not something. We don't always have words like yes and no, but we do have words for not, and we do understand the difference between this and not this. So that may be universal, and that's why I'm studying it here. But I'm not sure that culture versus nature is universal. I think that that's a construction of Levi-Strauss's, and of course he made a huge career out of it, and he lived to be 100, and wrote pretty much all of his adult life, so he's written a lot. His books are vast. Well, one of his books is called The Raw and the Cooked. Also very, very long book. And one of the things he's saying is that raw is natural and cooked is cultural. And of course humans cook food routinely. And one of the things that distinguishes us from other animals is that we control fire. And that by controlling fire, we're able to cook our food. And cooking our food probably goes back to before we were even Homo sapiens. It probably goes back to Homo erectus, because Homo erectus could use fire. And so Homo erectus probably cooked food. And Levi-Strauss is saying, well, we cook our food because we want to transform it. We don't want to be like animals. We don't want to be like lions and tigers that kill an animal and then rip it apart and eat it raw. We want to cook it and prepare it in all kinds of different ways to assert that we are not animals, that we are not part of nature, we are part of culture. Well, there's all kinds of problems with that. I mean, one of the reasons we cook our food is because it's easier to chew. Have you ever tried to kill a gazelle and then rip it apart and eat it? Good luck with that. It's a lot better if you can put it into a pot and you can boil it up and make a stew out of it, maybe add some herbs and spices and other vegetables and cook them together. So what Levi-Strauss wants to know is, why do we do that? And his answer is that we cook because we want to make it human. We want to take it away from the natural realm. Now I can modify my statements a little bit here by saying that I think that the culture-nature distinction is a current distinction for us. I mean, that's why we have natural versus artificial. I don't think it's a universal by any means. People who are foragers, that is, who hunt for their protein or fish for it, and who gather fruits and nuts and berries and vegetable materials, which was the human condition at one point before we invented the domestication of plants and animals. I don't think that those people, currently they might, but I think historically they did not make the distinction between culture and nature. Modern civilizations tend to think of those people as being somehow in a state of nature, I guess. But I think it's all a false dichotomy. And I certainly think it's not a universal. It's one that Western civilization has created. So I think Levi-Strauss is quite correct to say that it's a human neurosis. If you add to that a modern Western neurosis, it's something that Westerners, particularly subsequent to domestication, and maybe also subsequent to the Industrial Revolution, to great changes in human culture. I think we can safely say that in the period subsequent to the Industrial Revolution, also during and after colonialism, that we can definitely say it's a Western neurosis or a Western fixation, but it's not something that's universal. And it's not something that we need to fixate on. So we don't need to fixate on natural versus artificial, because that leads to the kind of dichotomy that we don't want. Like I said, not everything that's natural is good for you, and not everything that's artificial is bad for you. We need to be thinking in completely different terms. The one issue that I will conclude with is Levi-Strauss's Culinary Triangle. This one really amuses me, and I won't come out and say it's stupid, but it's not very smart. Here's the Culinary Triangle, and Levi-Strauss said we've got two opposites here. On the one hand, on the bottom of the triangle, we've got culture versus nature, and on the vertical axis, we've got transformed and not transformed. And so at the top, we've got raw, which is untransformed, and at the bottom we've got transformed, and we've got transformed in two ways. We've got nature and we've got culture. So that if something is transformed culturally, then it is cooked, and if it's transformed naturally, it's rotten. All right, so that's the raw, the cooked, and the rotten triangle. Well, here's the thing. We eat all three. We eat raw food, we eat cooked food, and we eat rotten food. Well, we don't call it rotten. Like blue cheese is transformed by bacteria. So Levi-Strauss thinks that's a natural process, and so it produces rotten food because fermentation, bacterial breakdown, and so forth are natural. We control those processes when we ferment beer, when we make blue cheese. When we make what Levi-Strauss wants to call rotten food, we control those processes. So in a sense, they're natural because they're bacteria or yeasts or whatever, but humans control them. So they're just as artificial as roasting or boiling or whatever. So the question to me is not putting things in dichotomies and triangles and so forth. The question is, why do we value certain ways of transforming foods over other ways? And how do we value them differently? And what I'm going to say is that this differs from culture to culture. That roasts in certain cultures are really, really important and of high prestige, and in other cultures, kinds of boiled foods, stews, are of the highest value. Like French cooking involves a lot of stews, like coq au vin, boeuf bourguignon, of high value. I don't know whether they're higher than roasts or not, but of high value. In Argentina, when you call it roasting, it's a la parrilla, asadar. It's the highest value. The meat cooked on the asado is of high value. So what I'm saying is that the Culinary Triangle is not universal, and culture versus nature is not universal. So it leaves me with my final question of the day before I say goodbye. What opposites are truly universal? We're going to be exploring a number of opposites over the next few weeks, and we'll find out that some of them probably are universal and some of them aren't. So I'll say goodbye and ask you to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.